This episode of the Briar Patch is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the nonprofit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org. Want to join the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode? Join the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field. We look forward to seeing you there.
This is Robert Picardo, the emergency medical hologram from Star Trek Voyager, and you're listening to Trek FM.
This is the 24th century. We've grown out of our infancy. People are no longer obsessed with the accumulation of things. We have eliminated hunger, want. Material needs no longer exist. The acquisition of wealth is no longer the driving force in our lives. Enjoy.
Welcome to the Briar Patch. I'm Patrick Devlin, joined by our co-host, Guinevere Liberty Nell. Hello, Guinevere.
Hi, Patrick. How are you?
Good. How are you today?
I'm great. I'm really excited about this.
Yeah, can't wait. Our first episode. And for today's episode, we're going to introduce the listeners to us and our show. Kind of what they can expect moving forward on this journey we're about to take. So, what brings you to Trek FM to do this show?
Well, I actually got into Star Trek kind of late in life. I mean, I'd seen it a few times before, but I didn't really get into Star Trek until, I guess, my late 20s. But when I did, when I really got to know Star Trek, I found that it's kind of unique in its ability to touch upon cultural and historical issues, and even more so, from my perspective, it is one of the few shows that really kind of gets into philosophy and social science and some of the really more interesting questions about life. And I'm quite into the social sciences myself, economics and politics, sociology, and so on. And that's why I want to do this show, because I think Star Trek really touches on some of these issues in a really intense, kind of detailed manner, actually analyzing these issues, which is very unusual, I think, when it comes to television shows especially. How about you? What brought you to Trek FM and to this particular podcast idea?
So originally, my history with Star Trek is, as a little kid, my father loved the original series, so I was watching it with him. We went on to The Next Generation, and unlike almost all Trek fans, he didn't have a huge pushback when it first came out. He actually welcomed the new Star Trek. And so I started watching, and who didn't love Picard growing up? I mean, he was great. Moving forward, my grandmother was a huge fan on the other side of my family, actually. So my mom's mother was a huge fan. So I ended up watching all the way through. I didn't watch Deep Space Nine and Voyager when they aired. I kind of fell off and then watched again later. And then we watched Enterprise, me and my grandmother, straight through, which is my favorite series for many reasons. One of which being that I lived in New York during 9/11, and season 3 is 9/11. That is their commentary. So I enjoyed seeing that perspective of it. At the time, I don't know if I necessarily agreed with their perspective of it, but I enjoyed seeing their perspective on it, and have grown to love it more and more as I've watched it farther and farther away from the incident.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned 9/11 and Enterprise and your connection there, because I was in New York when 9/11 happened, and I have to say, I'm not exaggerating, it completely changed my life. And it's actually what drove me to get into learning economics and social sciences. It's funny, actually, my father is an economics professor. And I always used to look at his economics books on the shelf in his office. And I always thought, wow, it looks really cool. I could imagine, getting into that one day when I was a kid. But when I grew up, I went to university and then I got into programming. And I never thought I thought I would live in New York forever. And I never thought I would get into economics. And then 9/11 happened and I literally saw it. I was standing and watching it down 6th Avenue when the second plane hit. And the thing was, I mean, obviously it was, a tragedy that I was like crying for a week. I grew up right near the Twin Towers. But also the thing was that I had no perspective, I had no understanding of who could have done it or why. I had never really heard of terrorism before, to be honest, at that point. And I wasn't I was politically minded in terms of wanting to go to protests, but I wasn't politically aware, of actual policy or anything like that. So after that, I decided I needed to learn. I needed to understand how that could have happened. I had thought nobody could penetrate America or New York, and do something like that. So that's kind of what got me into it. But when I first saw Enterprise, which wasn't until 10 years later, I didn't make that connection, interestingly. But when I did watch it all the way through, after that attack on Earth, my feeling in a way about, how it felt to see that brought back that feeling that I had when 9/11 happened. So for me, it has a gut connection, but I hadn't really made the connection kind of, that much in my, in a sort of rational mental way, kind of until someone else until you mentioned it. I hadn't really, when we were, in the turbolift, before podcasting, when you said that, I said, okay, I guess that is what they were talking about. It'll be interesting to have an episode on that at some point.
Yeah, I can't wait. I do guest on Warp 5 where we are doing a retrospective of season 3. And one of the reasons they put me on is because I have that New York connection and they like me. We're friends. So, but other than that, ironically, let's see, 2001, I was 19 years old. I was at St. John's University and I watched the towers disappear from the skyline from the highest point of Queens because that's where St. John's University sits. Their library is actually the highest land elevation of Queens. I basically immediately left, went home, went to my nearest Army recruiting station and joined the Army.
Wow.
My dad was a Vietnam vet. He passed away when I was 14 and I joined the Army to do intel.
Wow.
It's very odd, because I'm not your typical ex-Army person, but I'm sure that'll show here at points. But that's how that changed my life. I left school where I was going to become a programmer, interestingly enough, and I went into the Army, and then I have a career as a union electrician in New York City now. And I probably wouldn't trade. I mean, I trade the attack itself, but everything else I probably wouldn't trade for anything. I love my career. I love my family and the things that my career provides me at this point. And, that one moment changed the entire trajectory of my life. And then here's this TV show that's showing the same thing and has Trip, who's reacting a lot like a lot of Americans did at that moment and freaking out. And just, the first thing he does is he walks over to Archer and he says to him, this isn't going to be some, Starfleet nonsense, right? Like we're going to go there and we're going to beat them, right? We're not going to play games. And that's how a lot of people felt at the time.
Yeah, well, that is exactly how a lot of Americans felt in reaction to 9/11. They were ready to kind of drop the sort of the Federation ideology, the American version of that, and do something like preemptively strike, which is not something, Americans would tend to be willing to do, nor would Federation citizens. But when something like that happens, it changes the feeling of the country. It changes sometimes the ideology. Sometimes people are willing to give up security. Sometimes people are willing to give up their own values. And of course, one thing we learned throughout Star Trek is that you should not give up your values. Your values are your best friend, your best fighter, your best chance, as you learn from Janeway a lot. Even out in the Delta Quadrant with no allies, your best ally, she says, is their Federation values. As long as they stick to them, they will take the right steps. They will be able to find allies. They will be able to not become the enemy and actually succeed in a way that they can be proud of also, because, if you do give up your values, then even if you win the war, you've lost everything. It's the old adage, I can't remember which founding father said it, but, people who are willing to give up security for a little momentary liberty deserve neither. Or I said it backwards, didn't I? Willing to give up liberty for a little temporary security deserve neither.
Right. I believe it was Benjamin Franklin, but don't quote me.
Yeah, that could be.
But I do think it was Benjamin Franklin. No, it's absolutely true. And it's very easy to fall into those patterns, as we see in Star Trek constantly. We constantly see it. In fact, on the Babel conference, we were talking about such problems with the episode Drumhead, where the Admiral is witch hunting people, and she's falling into these traits where she says to Picard at one point, I've taken down bigger men than you. It didn't even matter what the truth was to her anymore.
No.
She just wanted to take him down because he challenged her.
Right.
And that's a problem. I mean, it's not a good thing, but the security of the fact that there could have been a traitor, even though there wasn't, was more important than the truth. And Picard has to be the voice of reason and tell her, no, the truth is what's important. You know, and we see Worf falling into it too throughout that episode.
Yeah. And this is what's great about Star Trek. It's almost like they're individual fables, many of the episodes, especially, I guess, TNG and Voyager. And some people have a problem with that sort of episodic thing, and they like, you know, a big story arc. And that's, you know, from a certain viewer perspective, you know, that may be preferable for a lot of people. But I think sometimes the self-contained episodes are some of the best because they capture more than just a moral tale. And I think quite often they're a social science tale. There can also be a philosophical tale and so on. But it's kind of like a fable where everything is very perfect. It's very kind of simple, but very perfect in representing the different issues and the different problems and where you could go wrong and things could go, you know, to hell, or where you can turn things around, what you can learn, what, you know, how you can advance a society. And it's all self-contained, you know, Measure of a Man, or the Voyager one with the Doctor, or some of the others about, you know, you could either go to where these people become slaves and you have a million datas or a million holograms doing the dirty work and the exocomps and so on, or you can, you know, realize that these people deserve rights and not look at some people as subhuman or less than sentient or whatever. And that affects how society goes forward, because even let's say they weren't really truly sentient, still the way you treat them affects the way that the society treats its own members who are considered equals or whatever as well. It affects the morality. It affects the interpersonal communications within the society that produce democracy. Anyway, yeah, I could go on all day about any one of these topics. And that's why I want to do this podcast, because we'll be able to get into more detail on these things as we go forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with almost, or actually all of what you just said. A few other episodes was and I'm terrible with episode names. I just am. But there was the episode where the doctor was going to help a hospital, but the hospital only tiered people by how much they were worth. Critical care.
We're definitely doing an episode on that, yes, for sure. I want to do that as one of our early ones as well. Fantastic episode.
Yes, and it's crazy because until you're in that position, you don't know if it's important or not. You know, which is the main objective of that whole episode. But in that episode, we also watched the doctor kind of compromise his values to get his point across. So at what point is compromising your values? Where does the ends justify the means?
Right.
You know?
Well, and there are different values that you always have to weigh. And so, you know, I mean, even, for example, war or resistance against a tyranny, even terrorism, arguably it can be like resistance or the same as resistance. You know, these definitions are difficult, but these things, hopefully you have a value of not killing people, not taking lives. But sometimes people feel they have to give up that value because there are other values like freedom, like equal rights for everyone, saving people who are being oppressed, saving your own people, your own family, whatever it is. And so you give up one value to gain another. And in that case, yeah, you might say that the ends justify the means, because obviously the means, killing people, you know, is not something you want to do. But I think, as we'll discuss in future episodes, for the most part, it's a terrible thing to believe that the ends justify the means, because usually that'll corrupt everything and fall apart. And that's, you know, that's sort of Janeway's argument throughout Voyager about keeping to the Starfleet values, because if you use other means, whether it's of getting home or something else along the way, it can corrupt everything that you're trying to do. And you can lose everything, all of the other things that you care about, all your other values like freedom and so on.
Oh, correct. You completely lose yourself. And you can talk about that from a psychological standpoint, but more specifically for our show, a sociological standpoint is the same thing, because groups, as we'll find, mostly through society, work as a mob mentality. And we only use that term when we mean something negative, but it really works both ways.
Absolutely.
If you go to church, everyone's singing psalms because everyone sings psalms. That's what you do. You don't sit there quietly. So it's still a mob mentality working. We just we see the word mob and think negatively, but it's just the way groups react.
It's a powerful force that can be used for good or evil. I mean, you even feel it when you go, say, to a football game or something, and you feel the crowd rushing up and to support their team. But then if you put that against another team, then it can become negative, or it can become, in the case of sports, hopefully it's positive competition rather than a brawl after the fact or something. But it's that same thing where people get behind something. It can turn into nationalism, or, other things at that societal level, or pitchfork mobs, on a sort of a more local level. But it can also be a powerful force that, is used like during war, when you need to get everyone together because, say, there aren't enough resources and you need to fund the army and stuff, and you have to get people excited and ready to get out there and to do what's necessary, make the sacrifices, work extra hard and so on to struggle through and get through. And that can be a positive thing. It can be used for many other things as well. And that's this kind of the collective versus the individual, in a less kind of rush of the mob kind of thing. I mean, there's a more day-to-day version of it where people come together and cooperate, whether it's, in a town hall meeting or getting together to help. Say, there was a terrorist incident, but there was also a fire recently in London, just yesterday or the other day, in this tower block, and it's tragic. There's all kinds of other things to talk about with that, of why it happened. But the thing is that when it did happen, people immediately came out, like people often do with natural disasters, to help each other out, to save people, to provide resources. And that kind of the community coming together can be a very positive thing.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I would like to go back on one thing, though, because you just brought up London and then you brought up a football game.
Right.
What our listeners don't know, because your accent doesn't show.
Right.
You're actually in London.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, I live in London now. I'm from New York, as I mentioned earlier. I have family from London, and I've been living in London now for about seven or 8 years.
Right, but when you say football, do you mean Manchester United?
I left that ambiguous. I was actually thinking of English or the European style football, because I went to a soccer match. Actually, it was Millwall, which probably most people listening won't know about them, but they're a South London football team in soccer football. But I mention it because the recent terrorist attack on London Bridge, which was terrible, but it was a few guys with knives. It was sickening. It was a horrible thing. But one thing happened in it that was kind of amazing is there was this Millwall fan who came out. I'm not going to say exactly what he said because it's a family show, but he said,
he's a soccer hooligan.
I'm Millwall. And he jumped on the guy and he struggled, and all the guys came to focus on him because he did that, and he saved the lives of all these people around him. But that's personal heroism more than it is but it is kind of the community coming together as well. But it's amazing, when we can tap into something in ourselves. He's a great hero, and everyone, he was very poor actually and didn't have a house or a job, and now everyone came together to crowdfund to get, I think they had £50,000 raised the last I heard to help him get on his feet because he's such a hero, and he's barely survived. He was stabbed in many places. Quite amazing story.
I did read that article. That was amazing.
Yeah.
No, I bring it up.
I went to a Millwall game, and I will tell you that crowd, that you can feel that mob thing with Millwall.
Yeah, you can with most English soccer clubs. Personally, I'm a Manchester United fan because in America that's all we hear about.
It's funny that anyone even knows any club in America.
I have the Cosmos autograph sitting behind me from New York, but yeah, I just found that funny because people here will hear football and think New York Giants, and people over there, like Lee Hutchinson, would think, Celtic or Millwall or Liverpool or something along those lines.
It's interesting living in England now. There's quite a lot of egalitarian spirit, but there is definitely a flavor of the class system that here still that you don't get in America. I mean, you obviously have low income and high income people in America, and the inequality is greater. But there's a kind of an old-fashioned class thing, and like a big part of it is accents. Like if you've heard David Cameron's accent, or Theresa May, but David Cameron, he looked and sounded, still looks and sounds presumably, very like, as they would call it here, a public school boy, which means actually a private school, a very fancy private school. He looks exactly like that. He has the exact accent. Actually, my half brothers both went to Oxford and have this kind of posh thing going on. And he had exactly that. And then, like, say the Millwall hero, they call him the Lion of London Bridge, because Millwall is the Lions. When you hear him speak, I mean, it's a definite, you wouldn't think they were from the same country. Just the accent is completely different, even though they probably both grew up, or they could have both grown up, like, say, in London. But it's just a different part of London, and you go to different types of schools, you hang out with different people, and obviously you get accent differences anywhere, but the way they look, the way they sound, it's just such you can tell the class thing is so obvious.
Yeah, see, no, I understand what you're saying, because here in America, it's not really so much a class thing. I mean, there is some of that. You tell by the way people talk and certain words they may or may not use or whatever, but it's more of a regional thing here in the United States where
exactly.
Like, I'm a New Yorker. You can hear I'm a New Yorker. I'm not from the South. I'm not from the West Coast,
Yeah, but I wouldn't know if you were raised with wealthy parents and several generations of wealth, or whether, you were raised low income or the first generation who's not, or the second gen, you wouldn't have any idea.
Right. It's just more of that I'm from New York. So yeah, but okay. So why don't you give our listeners a little background on, because you said you liked economics as a kid, then as you grew up, you didn't want to do that, and then you got into it. So give them a little background on your history in economics.
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, liked economics as a kid is a bit of an exaggeration, but, there was an inkling there. And I think, the same kind of inkling that got me into programming, maybe. I didn't, and I still don't really, I'm not a standard kind of academic. I don't have my PhD. I have kind of a bit of a funny background. As I said, I did programming first. I went back to university after 9/11. Dabbled, actually. I was going to go into biochemistry, but quickly realized I was spending all my time reading about and thinking about economics and policy and so on. And I actually, I discovered online, because they're quite an online community of economists, some Austrian economists at George Mason University. And the reason that I found them was because one of the things I was struggling with in trying to learn about the world when I got into economics is I had a lot of socialists in my family. My mom was a Leninist, and she had a roommate after my parents divorced who was a Stalinist, and they would have debates about who was better, Lenin or Stalin. And I had a lot of family like this. But I kind of, when I started learning about stuff, I thought, well, actually, and I learned about the Soviet Union and Mao and all of this stuff. And I said, actually, maybe this communism stuff doesn't work. And, I was just exploring all of this. I really hadn't thought about it deeply before this. And so I found these free market economists. So Austrian Economics is a school of economics. There were some of the original, founders of the school were from Austria, but that's the only connection it has to Austria. Basically, it's a group of free market economists based in kind of a classical economic theory more than a neoclassical one. So the neoclassical economists that are free market, say like Milton Friedman, still work with these kind of more mathematical, more precise kind of models using calculus and diagrams and supply and demand curves. But then from there, it gets more mathematical. The Austrian economists believe that this mathematical stuff is too simplistic and takes you away from the kind of more organic nature and the complex nature of economies and social systems. And this attracted me to them because I kind of agreed. When I learned in kind of Econ 101 about both the neoclassicals and the Keynesian schools and the other ones, they all seemed to simplify in certain ways that I didn't like and didn't believe. I didn't think they were realistic. Anyway, but the Austrian economists are very free market. They claim to be looking at things with their models and coming to conclusions based on the models, but it almost feels like they want to come to this conclusion because they always come to it. And there's a reason using their, basically, you have certain assumptions and it will lead you eventually to certain results. So after I got very, very into that and I started writing books about it, and I was reading a lot about the Soviet Union. I got very much into Soviet economic history, and this studying why didn't it work the way that people wanted it to work was my big question. And a lot of Austrian economists were asking that as well. So I kind of got into them through that as well. So I got very, very into Austrian economics. I wrote papers and books. But over some years, I came to realize that their assumptions were not quite right, in my opinion. And that brought them to more free market ends than then I think is justifiable. So I kind of found a post-Austrian approach where I didn't use all the same assumptions as them. So over the course of our podcast, I'll probably be mentioning the names of some of the founders of the Austrian school, like Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich von Hayek. Those are two of the major ones that we'll probably talk about, then various others, and Marx on the other side, and Lenin and some other people from that approach, and kind of looking at both of those. And also maybe we'll do a little bit of even looking at like Soviet economic history versus more free market economies or mixed economies. Although, we'll see. But I will probably be talking about these theories, and they're pretty easy to understand, really. We won't get into like anything too academic necessarily, but I think they raise a lot of interesting questions, which then apply to, to current policy problems and stuff as well. Because I believe that these kind of looking at the extremes and then figuring out what you can learn from that to also look at what most countries are, which is very much a mix of the two extremes, of the kind of socialist public sector stuff and the capitalist or free market and private sector stuff. And really we're always in between, but sometimes looking at the extreme helps you kind of see potential problems and the good and the bad of each side.
Right. Plus you can kind of see where on the scale you or let's say Star Trek are in that, which way they're leaning.
Yeah, right.
And maybe they're going one way and it reverses back the other way for a little while or something along those lines. But yeah, you need to know the ends, the far rights, far lefts of that scale you're using, whatever scale you're using. Right.
And also kind of like the goals, like Lenin had certain kind of utopian goals. Now, is the Federation moving more towards that? The fact that there's no money in the Federation, supposedly. That was very much what Lenin wanted. You have a lot of similarities with this some of the utopian ideals that Marx and Lenin had. But how did the Federation get there? You have the Austrian economists will argue that, until you can overcome scarcity, there's no way that you can achieve those, Leninist goals, or Marxist goals. But the Federation does look like it has kind of achieved, overcoming of scarcity. Perhaps that's something that we'll definitely need to discuss more. But, the Austrians will argue once you've achieved that, well, then any system will be almost like any other system. The trouble is that you'll never be able to actually overcome scarcity. And so we'll look at that. Did the Federation actually overcome scarcity? And also, if you truly achieve Lenin's goals, are you going to end up more like the Borg?
Right. Well, that's when the politics and the sociological side has to kick in, because as with most things, you can't just come up to an answer with one approach. You could say, well, we got rid of scarcity. Everyone has food. They have a house because they all have a replicator, and we can build houses all over the universe for people now. You can pick where you want to live. But what are the politicians doing with that? How are they using that? What does the society want to do with that? Who did they say vote into power or allow to come to power? All those things play into how you end up going. Every time you get to what you think is maybe an end, it's just another fork in the road for another discussion, I suppose. But yeah, I mean, it makes perfect sense. And then, like you said, why did Lenin fail? A number of those reasons. There was no post-scarcity system in place. There was no maybe the politics weren't right at the time, but
yeah, well, I mean, the one issue is that everyone thinks that we're about to overcome scarcity and now is the right time. And you can read some quotes from first Marx and then Lenin saying, well, now we finally become so rich that this will be possible. And you're talking about levels of GDP that today it would be GDP per capita of like India or something. For them, that was rich. That's not quite right, but approximately, because it was so long ago. And so if they look to us now poor, are we ever going to know when we've got to a place where we really have, has even the Federation gotten to a place where they could do it? Because if you have replicators and transporters and all of this stuff, but still you have a scarcity of time, what if some people don't want to work? Can the factories and the, AIs and all the machinery and everything, can that really do all the jobs that need to be done? That people, or are people going to want to do things that today sound really boring? Because otherwise the whole economy could fall apart as soon as you allow people not to work, for example. Right. I mean, that's one argument. I'm not sure that at all that that's true, but that's certainly one argument.
Right. And I think that we'll get into this later on at another time, but I think that basically Star Trek's answer to that was people did what they wanted, and later on they tried to retcon that a little bit by saying, well, we have all the holographic doctors doing all the work nobody wants to do.
Right, and then they're slaves.
Right, and then we're right back to the fact that they're not sentient, and that's why it's okay. But is it okay is a whole other question.
And what if they have any level of sentience, you know?
Right, and that's a whole other question, because when you had Measure of a Man, Picard stands up and goes, our mission is to seek out new life. Well, there it sits. You know?
Yeah.
And what you do today will decide whether we treat him and his kind like slaves or we treat them like people.
Exactly.
And, luckily for Data and all of us, because we love Data, they ruled on the side that Data was sentient and had the right to, ironically, to leave Starfleet.
Right.
So, but he didn't. He didn't leave. He just didn't have to go through the tests. But it was basically because he
had the right to choose.
Right. But the whole reason when it came up originally was because he said, okay, I can't, it's an order. I have to follow an order.
Right.
Starfleet is a military organization in terms of their hierarchy. So the only way I can get out of this is by resigning. So I resign. And they told him, well, you can't because you're property. So they basically ruled that he wasn't property, but he got to disobey an order, which is cool. But we see that happen a lot anyway in Star Trek. People disobey orders constantly.
But then the exact same issue came up with the Doctor. And you have all of his identical hologram people all working in the mines as slaves. And even when they had their trial, their Measure of a Man style trial, the judge wasn't ready to rule that the Doctor was actually a person. They only ruled that he was an artist.
Right, and he had limited rights to how his creation could be used, which was an interesting twist. But the last scene of that episode shows that the other holograms read his book, and I would have liked to see more of where they took that, but we never got anything back on it.
It's probably written about in one of the books or something, but I haven't.
Probably. We'll have to check out the guys over at Literary Treks and see what they have to say.
Yeah. But we should, I think I rambled on for a little while about some of the topics that I want to cover, and I mentioned Mises and Hayek. Do you want to say anything? I mean, I could also, I could mention a few more things that I want to talk about. We can, I don't know, read Keynes in the original Klingon.
I have to learn original Klingon now.
What else do you want to talk about?
No, I mean, look, my perspective, I'm not an economics buff. I've taken quite a few classes. They were usually given at some god-awful time in the morning because they were keeping it a secret. And I stole that joke. Before anyone calls me out on it, I stole that joke. I don't remember what comedian I stole it from, but I definitely stole it. But no, my perspective on this is going to be more of a historical and a sociological side of those social sciences and what Star Trek was trying to say about what was going on at the time or just before that time or what we can expect to come later, and I'll just go along for the rest of the ride. And I'll try and learn as we move on from here, more economic theorems or rules or laws, I guess they would be called. And we'll see where it takes us. I think that the strength of the Briar Patch is going to be the fact that we actually do attack these issues from two sides.
Yeah, and I mean, you may think, or listeners may think that I'm definitely coming from this kind of capitalist, free market, right wing, compared to you, at least, as you're a union guy, and on some points you're probably going to come across as a bit more, in favor of government intervention, say, or whatever than I am is possible. And I will be talking about, as I have stronger background in the more free market economic points of view. And I do think that some of the economics that comes from a less free market perspective is probably too accepting that, say, government is going to achieve the ends that it sets out to achieve. And when you go to the far extreme, like Marx and his followers, I think they're very wrong in terms of the way they set up their models. I personally believe that. And I believe that a lot of their theories were what led to the kind of tyranny that you got in pretty much every true attempt at achieving a Marxist communist state. And I think there are some good reasons for that. And a lot of that is what Austrians and other kind of libertarian scholars as well had warned about. For example, we haven't really discussed why we're calling this the Briar Patch, but I want to talk about that for a second. So one thing that the Briar Patch raises for me as a kind of a visual or a gut kind of connection is this idea that it's like this big kind of, thorny or, just, impossible to get through kind of space, this briar patch that you have to try to get through to get somewhere. So if your goal is to have a utopia, or even to just achieve a society that you want, a better society than you had yesterday, if you are actually trying to do it, trying to achieve it as a group or as an individual leader, you're going to get stuck in this briar patch, probably in that you can't just get what you want. A lot of times, that's the problem. We have good intentions, but it comes out all wrong. So for me, that raises a lot of the kind of things that I'm going to talk about with the Austrian ideas and stuff. And also the briar patch obviously comes from insurrection. And that's an interesting case study of, say, forced migration, of moving a people away from where they're, and if we do get deep into that, maybe our next episode, I think is very interesting, because the only sort of political science theory that would immediately protect the Baku, in a sense, and explain why, Data, with his, having only morality to guide him, believed that the Federation was in the wrong and Baku should be protected. The only real theory that jumps out at me in terms of protecting them from a kind of political science point of view is a libertarian one, is the non-aggression principle. But that raises some very interesting questions that the movie also raises, because, so one of the main problems with the non-aggression principle, why people don't like it, why people don't like libertarians and think they're heartless and terrible, is because you could be like super rich and you could have inherited that wealth from, say, ancestors who had slaves, who got it through force. And so you're saying the non-aggression principle says, you can't use force except for to protect people's basic rights. The same right, you have complete freedom, except for you can't infringe upon someone else's rights, and the government can use force to stop you from infringing on other people's rights. So if that's it, and you can't be forced to pay taxes, and you can't be forced in any coercive way by government, then that means that the really rich, really lucky people who got it, who inherited it through a history that was, violent or whatever, still get to have it and still get to stay rich, and the poor can stay poor. And that's, in a way, in the Briar Patch, you have the same kind of thing. You have these very, very lucky elite Baku who have immortality, who have a paradise, and they get to keep it because nobody can use force against them. And what about the rest of the galaxy? Or what about the rest of their own society who got kicked out, who they were violent to in the past? Well, they don't get anything, And so it's almost just protect who has it right now. It's like, there's actually, sorry, I'll let you jump in a second, but there's a very funny thing that captures what I'm saying here, which is libertarianism starting right now. One guy says to another, look, a lot of stuff has happened. My ancestors stole your ancestors. And his friend says, no, but look, you stole my iPad just now. And the first guy says, well, do you really want to go back to the beginning of time and sort out all the injustices of history? And the guy says, no, I just want my iPad back. And so the first guy says, but look, you want to correct the injustices that have happened in the last 5 minutes, but ignore the ones that happened prior to that? That's arbitrary. The only non-arbitrary approach is to start fresh from where we are. I'm sorry I took your iPad. I can see now that respect from property rights is important. So let's be better. Life, liberty, and property starting now. And he gets to keep the iPad. And that's kind of it. That's what happened with the Baku. And that's kind of what would happen if we started with a libertarian thing right now. And all the rich are rich and they get to keep their wealth.
Right. No, absolutely. And that's a perfect analogy to that movie, as we'll get into at some point, I'm sure, probably very soon. But, I mean, we're going to go over a lot of things in a lot of different angles. And economics is going to play a huge role because economics dictates a society in many ways. If I can't feed my family, I can't really fight for anything else. It starts there, may not, or it ends there and not start there one time, or, it jumps where in the scale it goes. But yeah, I'm sure we're going to get into a lot of it, and a lot of our topics from my side and your side are going to overlap, and a lot of them are going to shoot in different directions because we'll find when you look at a society that it doesn't always necessarily believe the data in the first place. Something may be saying one thing. We'll take the debate. I'm not going to pick a side, but let's take the debate over the United States health system and the United Kingdom's health system, right? Okay. There is data for both sides. And there are people standing in the same house There are people who live together that will vehemently disagree on which one of those two systems are better. Somewhere there's a fact, but the fact is one of them's right or one of them is wrong, or at least in a portion of it, one of them is right and one of them is wrong.
The world is so complex, though. Sometimes there isn't necessarily a smoking gun. Thinking about, the current political trials and so on, you might not find, or Watergate, which it's being compared to, you might not find a smoking gun for that. And you might not find a clear piece of data that says definitively this type of system is better than that, or this, this type of program or this type of thing, because there are so many different things, so many different people being affected in different ways. The NHS has a very good system for caring for people, kind of a nursing care system, and it's tied into the welfare state. It could have that, and I'm not saying it does, but it could have something negative on the more medical side, like longer wait times for cancer or something. Although then you have the problem of actually getting data sometimes in America, because you have so many different people see different doctors if they're private or if they have Medicaid. You have less of that in England. So you have these, different outcomes for different types of people in America, perhaps, and also a difficulty of gathering the data,
right?
Of knowing, of being able to compare. But even if you had all the data, you might not still know which is better.
Well, you also have a problem where there are things that would seem to be outside of that system that are heavily affected by that system, or vice versa. And what I mean
absolutely.
is pharmaceuticals is definitely part of the system, but the research people think of as, well, scientists do research. That's just what they do. But they do that research with the money made from selling the pharmaceuticals in the first place. And if you look at it from the point of view of a pharmaceutical company, they have to make a lot of money in their mind, whether it's short.
No,
they have to make a lot of money to cover.
Very expensive.
Right.
Very expensive to produce a new drug. But you also there, you have the basic research, which may be funded through the educational system and through more other public means and grants and stuff. And then you have the money-making research, and you probably need both. And certainly the pharmaceuticals need to be able to make some profit to be able to do that, I think. I don't think you could have that all public sector pharmaceutical. That would not work,
No, I don't think.
In my opinion.
No, and I don't think the pharmaceutical companies themselves should be all public. But what I mean is, people make the argument, at least here in America, people make the argument that without America being the system that it is and paying so much money into the system out of people's pockets, the pharmaceutical companies would not have the money to recoup their losses. Look, for every one drug they come out with, there's 10 flops. There's 10 that they spend billions of dollars on and go nowhere. They don't make a profit. People have, I don't want to say that they see the data they want to see, but people go, well, let's take, I don't want to give a name brand. Let's just take medicine for heart attacks, right? Well, you charge me $10 a pill, but my insurance company picks up $50 a pill. So now it's $60 a pill, right? So that's what they're paying. They don't realize that their insurance company is really only paying pennies on that dollar, but that's irrelevant for this conversation. They say that pill cost a penny to make. Yeah, but it cost $4.2 billion to research and develop. And then it cost, there was 7 failed attempts that cost $1 billion a piece before that. And then that's not even really what you're covering. What you're really covering is the next 7 failures before they come up with the next one. And one of the biggest oppositions to a system like Canada and the UK and other places have here is, well, if we did that, then who would be paying for the new development? And I think a lot of that is people don't have all the data, though. It's not like these companies are making nothing off of those countries.
No, but they do a bulk buy and they try to keep the price down. And the question is whether Americans are subsidizing that, because by Americans not getting this bulk deal and paying more, they're able to give a lower price to the bulk deals of other countries. And so it's true, if the system in America is changed and America started bulk buying and so forth as well, you might find that suddenly they're not able to produce nearly as many new drugs, and they might focus even more on the, if you will, the sort of more popular but less important drugs, instead of the, say, malaria pills and other things that they're not able to make that money from in, say, America. If they're not able to make money off of Americans as much, then they'll focus on getting that profit from somewhere, from someone, from a few products, and they won't have as much extra money to put into things where they're not making a big profit.
Right.
That's the argument. That's one argument.
No, and I understand. And this is, again, where the sociology comes in, not just the economics, because what I hear is it's my responsibility to make sure the rest of you have good medicine. Ironically, the people who argue that they don't want the system like the UK are the same people who don't want to subsidize the poor, but that's irrelevant. So it's a sociological conundrum.
Well, I mean, that's one problem right now with policy discussion. It gets so sort of politicized and people's ideology, and they get kind of so wrapped up in it. And you find that people will jump from one justification or explanation to another to get the other side to agree. So you might find, even if they don't care about the poor, say, and I'm not saying they don't, but even if they don't care about the poor, they may use that argument to win you over, because you may be on the other side not realizing that you could unintentionally hurt the poor. But I will defend people that seem to not care about the poor in saying that a lot of them, their beliefs about how things work, they may care very much about the poor, but they believe that government should not be the one to help them. And redistribution is going to hurt the poor in the long run, because you need growth for the poor to be able to have a better standard of living, for, to have the economic growth and so forth that's necessary for the poor to climb out of their poverty and to have a better standard of living. Of course, there are also people that don't care about the poor at all.
Yeah, no, and I agree with that. No, my only point is that it just seems contradictory that they don't want to help the poor because, like you said, for whatever reason, either they don't like them or they believe there needs to be growth or the trickle down effect, or whatever reason they come up with that they have. But at the same time, they want to make sure that we pay enough to create medicines for all the countries of the world. It just seems like a massive contradiction in and of itself, because they're saying, well, without us, they can't get it. Okay, well then I want us all to pool our taxes and everyone will live happily. Oh, no, I don't want that. But wait, without us, they won't have it. No, I meant drugs, not rent.
I'm not sure who you're talking about specifically. You may be grouping too many people together, but I do think for some people, it might be a consistent argument. And what they're saying is that the poor will be better off through better use of the market and competition and so forth. And if that means that Americans do subsidize some of this so that the medicine can get out to the poor, similarly, the Americans could be made worse off to help the poor if they are immigrants into America, because they might drag the wages down a bit. But libertarians would still want that, and they'll make the argument it's going to help the poor in other countries, even at the cost of American workers. So there's a subsidy going on there in a sense. But what they're saying is everyone's going to be made better off by using these market forces rather than trying to have government help the poor directly. They're going to say that's actually not as good for the poor if we pool our resources and redistribute and give it directly to the poor. That's actually going to hurt them. But we'll get into all of that. I think we've gone on a few tangents already, and I think that's kind of a long discussion for another day, don't you think?
Yeah, I would believe so. So I guess now's as good time of any as do you have any final thoughts you'd like to pass on to the listener about what they can expect, and not just rants and raves about, not paying for drugs?
Right. Yeah. This has been, sort of an intro episode, and we went off onto a lot of these tangents, but I think in the future, we're not going to go on rants and raves and discuss, current policy things. I think the way that I see us doing this is we'll have a lot of episodes where we'll focus on a particular Star Trek episode and get kind of really into the details of what's going on and looking at it. Like when I was talking about Insurrection, we could get into a lot of details about what happened in that film and how it connects to some of these more theoretical ideas. Like in that case, the non-aggression principle is the one that I connect to straight away, but I'm sure there are others. And critical care we mentioned, that one is we're definitely going to have a podcast episode just looking at that. I think it's an amazing episode from a couple of perspectives and a lot to dig through there, a lot to pick through. And then in terms of like concepts and ideas, I'm very interested in talking a lot about utopia and scarcity, that kind of question, and communal versus individual, Federation, Borg, but you can have like the Ferengi and culture, and the Ferengi and scarcity, and the Ferengi and utopia even, although I can't imagine a utopian Ferengi society really. We'll talk about all of that and culture and the way all of those ideas tie into the different Star Trek species, aliens. We'll talk about libertarianism and the different things like utilitarianism and consequentialism and other ideas that tie into the libertarian theories. Socialism, communism versus markets, obviously, which we've mentioned both from a kind of theoretical, like Marxist and Austrian kind of side, as well as maybe some actual outcomes and stuff. And I mentioned Mises and Hayek. From Mises, we learn a lot about socialism and the calculation problem and stuff. From Hayek, we learn about the knowledge problem and things like that. But he also talks about spontaneous order, the evolution of culture. And I know the evolution of culture is a big thing that we get in Star Trek, because you see societies evolving over time, both technologically and culturally, and tying into the idea of the Federation as utopian and the cultural changes required to get there. And Hayek also talks about the complexity of the world. Complex adaptive systems is a recent kind of field that goes into that, and Hayek is connected to that. And then there's just basic stuff, supply and demand, self-interest, profit incentive, paternalism, bureaucracy, authoritarianism and hierarchy is a big one. There's a lot of questions about that, which like inside Starfleet, obviously, but then what about the Federation at large? Is it really democratic? Is there any kind of authoritarianism there? And then like Cardassia and Bajor, insurgent movement and all of that, and the tyranny of the Cardassians and so on. And then, other economic ideas, rent-seeking, collective action problems, moral hazard, adverse selection, and so on and so forth. I mean, there's just a ton of stuff, and it ties into all the different episodes, as well as like the universe as a whole, the Star Trek universe as a whole. And that was a mouthful. How about you? What do you hope to talk about?
Not that much. No.
Well, this is going forth into many episodes. I see a grand future.
Yes.
I see a long and happy grand future for us. Many episodes.
I kid. That's just a lot to follow. I mean, I think you hit literally everything. I would just like to say that I would also like to take a lot of these episodes and look at how culturally they match the history of the time period or the time period before that. TOS talked a lot about World War II, as much of TV at the time did, or how it talks about the Korean War.
You know that there was a Maquis resistance movement in World War II?
Yes, actually, yes, I did know that.
A French resistance,
Yes.
Oh, you said I said literally everything. I touched upon literally everything, but you know what I forgot in that little speech there? I forgot to mention, again, Keynes in the original Klingon.
Yes. And we will, for those who don't know Klingon, we will break it down. I guess we'll do a post in Fable and have all the words and their translations, and it'll be easier for you.
Does Google Translate do Klingon?
I don't think so.
Oh, then we're going to have to pull out our dictionaries and do it ourselves.
Do it the hard way.
That'll be fun.
Yeah. So it'll be a lot
Unless we can actually get Keynes in the original Klingon, but we'd have to probably go all the way to Kronos or something to get it.
And that's hard. That's very hard. Warp drive is very slow right now. It's not going very well. But they are going to have a race around the moon in 2 years at NASA. It was announced today. So who knows?
Really?
Maybe they'll have a warp race next year.
Yeah.
3 years from now. So we'll see how that goes. No, but yeah, so I mean, my final thoughts really are simple. I just want to put out a good show that people can relate to. I want them to kind of see the social aspects that Star Trek put out there, because that's what was important to me about Star Trek. It was the fact that I took a sociology class when I was in junior high school, and basically every other class I got to watch a Star Trek episode, which was really cool, because who gets to watch TV in school? And mostly TOS, but some Next Generation at the time.
Wow, you had a pretty cool teacher.
Yeah, she was also the dean, which is even cooler, right? Because now I was cool with her, so when I got in trouble, it wasn't so bad. But I just want to talk about the history of how Star Trek became what it was.
You should probably get in touch with that dean if they're still around and let them know about your podcast.
Yeah, no, I definitely should go back to my old junior high school, see where they're at.
I will say one other thing, which is that I believe in staying in universe when we're having these discussions, especially as we get into the nitty gritty of particular episodes. I don't want to hear things like, oh, well, that was just bad writing or something. That's not really what they must have meant. No, that's what they said. That's what they meant. That's history. Because that allows you, I think, to do a better analysis of it. You take things at face value, at what happened in the episode, and you work within that universe. And that gives you something to grab onto when you're looking at what lessons you can take out of it.
It's been fun talking about why we got into Star Trek and podcasting today, but this isn't the only thing we've been discussing on the network. So here's a quick look at some of the other things you may have missed elsewhere on Trek FM.
Previously on Trek.fm, the 602 Club. And this is happening a lot more in the Star Wars books, and I think it's because it allows them freedom, which is to do books that become character studies. And I think it's very clear that this book, in a lot of ways, is a character study of who this person is and what it is that causes the actions that we see in The Force Awakens to make more sense.
Stage 9, a podcast about the people who make Star Trek.
By getting people like Braga to come on board and work on this show, what they're going to be doing is deconstructing that thing that they did for all those years on Star Trek.
Earl Grey.
Is there anything else we need to add, or do we think that's the...
Are we going to cure Riker, or?
Oh shoot! I forgot about Riker. Yeah, sure, fine. We'll keep him around.
Yeah, we've cured Riker, and then for me, this would or not.
Meta Treks.
Troy's quarters, Data's quarters.
They're very Spartan.
They're very Spartan.
In fact, Data's girlfriend even says they're Spartan, right?
Yes. And so what does she do? She brings him stuff.
A trinket to fill it up.
to fill it up.
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
Check out all these shows and join the conversation about your favorite corner of Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcast. If you're an Apple user, be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcast, on iPhone, iPad, or Apple TV, or on your desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they're published. And please leave us a star rating and written review. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Speaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, in most third-party apps, and you can stream and download the MP3 files from a website or grab the RSS link. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's show, and there are many ways for you to do that. The best place to join the larger conversation is the Fable Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type Fable, B-A-B-E-L, into the search field on Facebook, and it should come right up. If you'd like to send us an email, you can use the form on the website at trek.fm/contact. Choose message to a Trek FM show and select the Briar Patch. That will come right to us. You can also find the network on Twitter at TrekFM, at facebook.com/TrekFM. Well, Guinevere, when you're not hanging out on a small planet in the Briar Patch getting younger, where can our listeners find you on the internet and around the Trek FM network?
Well, Patrick, I can be found on Facebook quite often, one of my favorite places. So you can search for my name, Guinevere Nell. I'll spell that for you. Guinevere is Guinevere. That's my first name. And Nell, Nell. And on Twitter, I'm Guinevere42. And I'm quite often going to be in the Fable Conference on Facebook, checking out what people have to say about the show, hopefully. And Patrick, how about you? When you're not getting younger on a small planet in the Briar Patch, where can people find you?
I can be found on the Fable Conference. I'm there every day. I can also be found on Twitter at MagicDrop5, one word, the number 5, not a word. If you'd like to help us keep all our shows coming to you each week, you can become a patron on the network at Patreon. Visit patreon.com/TrekFM. That's patreon.com/TrekFM to get all the details. Perks include early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and more, available through our special patrons website, Patron Zone. It requires a great deal of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month. We really appreciate any support you can give us and hope that you'll join the team. Again, you'll find those details at patreon.com/TrekFM. We'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the rest of the Briar Patch team from the network, specifically C. Brian Jones, founder and publisher of Trek FM, executive producers Matt Rushing and Ken Tripp, Aaron Harvey, art director, Richard Marquez, production manager, patron manager Brandon Shea Mutala.
Well, we must be heading back into the Briar Patch now on our way to finding Utopia. It takes about a day to get a message back, so till next time, this is Guinevere and Patrick signing out.